In 1917, the area of Flanders to the east of Ypres was of great strategic importance. For the Allies, it was the gateway to breaking out of the stalemate in the north and retaking Belgium. For the Germans on the high ground, it was a dagger at the Allies' throat. If the British could only break out of the Ypres salient and take it, they could turn north and drive the Germans from the Belgian coast and capture the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge from the enemy. The German position in Belgium would be outflanked, and their industrial heartland in the Ruhr would be under threat. In addition, U-boats were operating out of Zeebrugge with great success, and the Admiralty was increasingly gloomy about what would happen in the English Channel if the Belgian ports were not closed to the enemy. An attack in Flanders would also hold down the German reserves and relieve the pressure on the French, who needed time to recover from the bloody shambles of Verdun that had caused the French army to mutiny. His plan was to strike out of Ypres to the north and east, and in conjunction with a seaborne landing on the coast of Belgium at Nieuport, he would capture the high ground at Passchendaele, which was the key to the whole area. The Germans were well aware of the strategic importance of Flanders. That's why Ypres was the most heavily fortified part of their line. British security was very poor, and the Germans knew all about the forthcoming battle and had taken their countermeasures well in advance. 4 days before the battle was due to begin, the Germans carried out a tactical retreat from their front line back to the Passchendaele Ridge. This left a zone of real and potential marshland in the low-lying land between their new front line and the British. Their new positions, the Hindenburg Line, were a defence in depth of 3 lines, the third being beyond the range of the British guns. Between these lines was barbed wire, scattered concrete pillboxes, and machine gun nests. The barbed wire funneled the attackers into killing zones, swept by machine guns and carefully registered by the artillery so that the attackers could be annihilated by a crippling concentration of shells. They also had the secret weapon of mustard gas, delivered by shell fire. This was a liquid that caused blistering of the skin if touched, or if the unfortunate soldier even walked through the zone of evaporation, the effect on the eyes was disastrous. If inhaled, it could cause pulmonary edema. Haig ordered a 2-week preliminary bombardment that was so severe, one German division actually deserted its front.
Until yesterday, most of those addressing us with a comprehensive sweep of the pointer across the map have declared that by 0 hour, all the German trenches will be obliterated by our shells, a tale we've heard before. The last lecturer, however, ominously omitted to provide this comforting assurance.
Unfortunately, the German counter-battery fire was not affected, and the Australian artillery suffered greatly as it had to be exposed on the open flats.
There were opportunities enough for death or glory, but the experienced sense observed that people did not espouse them with the comparatively bright eye of a year before. 1917 was distasteful.
The battle commenced on the 31st of July with an attack on the northern flats at Pilken to the left and the Gelufeld Ridge to the right. The troops at Pilken were to be supported by massed tanks, and this attack was initially successful, but unfortunately the right flank was held up and failed to reach its objective at the Gelufeld Ridge. Then, at 4 p.m., the rain started. It lasted for days, making it impossible for the tanks to operate. Although Haig had originally only proposed a short battle to break through the German lines, now that was patently impossible, yet he still insisted on continuing the battle. He then decided to change the axis of attack from the north to the east, and, when finer weather came, to order the assault on the ridge itself. Haig also changed generals, and General Plumer was put in charge of the next assault. Plumer, one of the most astute of the generals, was an advocate of a small-scale, limited advance under cover of a creeping barrage which would also prevent the German counterattacks. The men were to advance behind the shelter of the exploding shells and be hidden from the enemy by the smoke and dust of the barrage. However, this would, of course, be impossible if it rained, and the ground turned into liquid mud. The Battle of Menin Road on the 20th of September was the first use of the new tactics. At dawn on that day, after a 5-day bombardment, the Anzacs made a successful attack with 2 Australian divisions side by side and supported by a Scottish division on their left. The Australians reached the lower part of Polygon Wood and Black Watch Corner. This cost them 5,000 casualties. On September the 26th, the weather was still fine and the ground had dried out. On that day, Plumer's rolling barrage worked well, and the Anzacs were able to advance, concealed by a barrage, like a Gippsland bushfire, as Beale put it. The 4th Australian Division then took the rest of Polygon Wood, or what was left of it, and the boot. They thus reached a position where they could strike at the main Broodseinde Ridge. The waiting Australian troops were mortared in their trenches by the enemy, and as they went over the top, they were surprised to see German troops advancing under cover of the mortar bombardment. By chance, the opposing troops had each launched an assault on each other at the same time. An old-fashioned bayonet charge by the Australians drove the Germans back. However, a German machine gun was raking the line and holding up part of the attack. Sergeant Lewis McGee, armed only with a revolver, ran 50 yards across bullet-swept ground, shot the crew and captured the gun. He then reorganized the advance. After the bayonet charge, the Germans retreated to their trenches, where they and their reserves were caught by the British creeping barrage. The barrage wandered deep into the German lines, and then came back for the Australians, who followed and eventually captured the ridge on October the 4th, a day described by Ludendorff as the German Black Day. When the Australians reached the ridge, they were able at long last to see the German rear line stretching before them. The only obstacle to their success was the German-occupied village of Passchendaele to the north. This smashing victory vindicated General Plumer's step-by-step technique, and was possible only because the weather had been dry enough to allow the quagmire to drain away. But now it started to rain again. It was not a shower, but a steady, soaking downpour.
It rained absolutely continuously. One was as afraid of getting drowned as one was of getting hit by shells.
There was no chance of getting wounded and getting a blighty one at Passchendaele. You'd either get through or die, because if you're wounded and you slip off the duckboards, you just sank into the mud.
The mud was so deep that with drag ropes on the wheels and something like 100 men on the drag ropes, it was impossible to pull the guns out of the mud.
Haig, however, encouraged by the 3 successes, ignored the rain and decided to make a further attempt to break the Germans on the ridge, even alerting the cavalry to be ready to follow up. He ordered the Anzacs to take Passchendaele on October the 9th, even though the wind and rain had now developed into a gale-force storm. Haig appeared to be quite unaware of the appalling conditions on the front, or that the wire had not been cut and the Germans had replaced their soldiers with fresh support troops in their relatively dry pillboxes. The Australians attacked, and at Augustus Wood, near the Tyne Cot, Captain Clarence Jeffreys organised a party and attacked a pillbox, capturing 4 machine guns and 35 prisoners. He led another charge on the next blockhouse when he was killed by machine gun fire. Every officer of the Aussie battalion was killed or wounded that day. Incredibly, 20 men actually reached the rubble that used to be Passchendaele Church. Unfortunately, the British troops on their right were unable to support them, and the Australians were forced to retreat all the way back to the mud holes that had been their front line. By now, their artillery was running out of ammunition, and their shells were burying themselves in the liquid mud and expending themselves relatively harmlessly in a cloud of steam and a fountain of water. Yet even now, Haig went on with the battle, even though the rain and bitter cold had set in. On October the 12th, he ordered another attack. It failed miserably, with men struggling up to their knees and waists in the dreadful, stinking mud, and with their rifles and machine guns clogged with it. The only solid objects in this endless waste of cratered mud were the German concrete pillboxes with their machine guns. This final mad attack cost 7,000 casualties. The Australian 3rd Division lost 3,199 lives in the 24 hours of this attack. At last, the exhausted Australians were withdrawn. But Haig was still pathologically obsessed with capturing Passchendaele. He ordered the Canadians to take over the battle. However, Canadian General Currie still had some common sense and refused to advance until the weather had eased and adequate supplies were available. On November the 12th, the Canadians did advance and took Passchendaele, or what was left of it. The British gained their objective, although it was quite useless to them in terms of the original plan. Passchendaele cost over 500,000 lives over its 3 months. The Germans lost about 250,000 men, and the British 300,000, of whom 36,500 were Australian. 90,000 British and Australian bodies were never identified. 42,000 were never recovered. Although its morale and manpower were stretched almost to breaking point by the fighting at Ypres, the BEF nevertheless made one more offensive effort in 1917. On the 20th of November at Cambrai, the British concentrated their tanks so that for the first time they were deployed for a mass attack rather than scattered in small groups along the front for local infantry support.
But then one day we were in the wagon line, quite a few of us, and somebody came along and said, "Oh, the war's finished." Oh, well, just go down about half a mile down the road and look in the field there, you'll see. Won't tell us why. And yeah, we went down, and quite a crowd there. And there are tanks.
The assault at Cambrai evolved from a tank corps plan for a large-scale raid, the chief object of which was not to seize ground, but to deal the Germans a bruising blow on terrain which, unlike Ypres salient, actually suited tanks. The Third Army Staff expanded the scheme between August and November, transforming it into a major operation against the Hindenburg Line. Both Haig and General Byng perceived advantages in a plan which might not only rebuild the BEF's reputation and revive morale, but also simultaneously draw the enemy's gaze from the Italian front, where the Italians had suffered a near catastrophic defeat at Caporetto on the 24th of October. The Third Army hoped to pierce the Hindenburg system between the Canal du Nord and the Canal de l'Escaut before sending cavalry through the breach to secure crossing over the Sancy and isolate Cambrai. Infantry and tanks, after taking Bourlon Wood, were then to clear the Germans from Cambrai and the area between the principal waterways. The main drawback was that the attrition at Ypres and the demands of the Italian front left the BEF with scanty reserves for any exploitation at Cambrai. In short, the plan had outgrown the resources which the BEF possessed in late 1917. Nor was it helped by Byng's desire to employ all the available tanks and infantry divisions in the breakthrough phase. On the positive side, the plan combined some promising tactical elements. These included the decision to abandon the customary long artillery preparation and to permit 1,003 supporting guns to deliver a surprise hurricane bombardment, capitalizing on the new technique of predicted shooting without prior registration of targets. Another novel aspect was the drill for tank infantry cooperation, developed by the Tank Corps and endorsed by Byng. 378 fighting tanks, all carrying large brushwood bundles or fascines to assist them across trenches, would operate in groups of 3. In each group, an advanced guard tank would move 100 yards ahead of two main body tanks, its task to subdue German fire and protect the two following tanks. The latter would lead infantry sections through the German wires and over the opposing trenches. Moreover, the British, profiting from the lessons of 3rd Ypres, made greater use of low-flying aircraft to strike German artillery and troops. The opening assault by 6 infantry divisions was made along a 6-mile sector at 6:20 a.m. on the 20th of November 1917. The surprise achieved by the sudden bombardment and the employment of massed tanks enabled Byng's formations, in most places, to break through the Hindenburg front and support systems to a depth of 3 miles. However, in the centre, the 51st Highland Division failed to take the key village of Flesquières on the first day. Many of its accompanying tanks either broke down short of the objectives or were disabled by German gunners who'd created specially trained anti-tank squads. By the 23rd of November, only 92 tanks remained operational, and because the British cavalry were unable to exploit the initial breach, the old problem of maintaining the impetus of an advance beyond the assault phase again appeared to defy solution. Over the next few days, the Third Army was involved in what was essentially a fierce infantry battle for Bourlon Ridge, west of Cambrai. For all their efforts, the British divisions never completely secured the ridge or neighbouring village. They were left with holding a salient 3 miles wide and 4 miles deep. On the 30th of November, the Germans launched a savage counterstroke against this salient. The German counterblow included deployment of stormtroopers, forcing the British back to a line in front of Flesquières, giving up most of the ground won. By the 5th of December, the fighting was over. Casualties at Cambrai totaled more than 40,000 on each side, but the most significant aspect of the battle was that both sides achieved a measure of success with tactical methods which at last seemed to offer a way out of the long-standing deadlock.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming.
In 1917, Europe, all of Europe, was on the verge of bankruptcy. It had swept like a black storm over Europe, consuming the flower of an entire generation and leaving in its wake unimaginable carnage. The terrible cost of the war in Russia already had toppled its government. The new Bolshevik government was pleading with Germany for peace negotiations. By the time the combined force of the United States Army and Marine Corps units faced the German army across the Marne River in northeastern France in the spring of 1918, the Great War had raged for almost 4 years. In June 1918, exhausted by 4 years of war and on the verge of defeat, the Allied forces on the western front of the Great War had but one glimmer of hope. The long-awaited news that the Yanks are coming. Imperial Germany, in a last all-or-nothing attempt to win the 4-year-old war, had thrown everything it had at the British and French lines. German infantry and artillery units were massed at the Marne River, less than 60 miles from Paris. Their great spring offensive stood on the edge of a knife. If they could push just those 60 more miles before the Yanks arrived in full force, they could finally end and win the war. Broken and war-weary, the Allies had one hope: fresh troops in America. When the United States finally had been jolted from its neutrality by constant attacks on its merchant ships and had declared war on Germany in April 1917, no one doubted that American military might would turn the tide of the war and send the Germans home if they arrived in time. The problem with this great tide of enthusiasm, though, was that it was based on an utterly mistaken assumption. For America, in truth, had no military might. In April 1916, the United States were as poorly prepared to go to war as any nation in history. It ranked in size 17th in the world. It had no experience of large-scale operations since Appomattox 52 years earlier, and it possessed no modern equipment heavier than its medium machine guns. Yet by June 1917, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force had arrived in France. The US Army had fewer than 135,000 troops. The US Marine Corps had only a few thousand men. These troops were not organized or trained for combat, and they lacked even the most basic supplies. When war was declared, the army struggled to find enough guns for its recruits even to train with. Once the United States declared war on Germany, a great wave of patriotism had driven men by the thousands into the Army, Navy, and Marine recruiting offices. In the summer of 1917, the War Department managed to put together enough men and material to send a division to war in France as the American Expeditionary Force, under the command of Major General John J. Pershing. When the doughboys of the Army and Marines arrived in France, they would combine into fighting divisions. The brash young Yanks chafed at the bit to prove themselves, and their chance would come soon enough. Russia's exit from the war after the fall of the Tsar meant the Germans no longer would be required to fight on two fronts. The 80 divisions of men and material that Germany had committed to fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front now could be shifted to the Western Front, giving Germany, for the first time, complete superiority in strength and numbers over the Allies in Belgium and France. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, commander of the German armed forces, wrote to the Kaiser for approval of a massive new campaign in the West, saying,
"No longer threatened in the rear, we could turn to the great decision in the West and must now address ourselves to the passage of arms."
For weeks, von Hindenburg and his Supreme Command vied with the German diplomatic corps for the Kaiser's ear. The German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, believed the war could not be won and that the Kaiser should sue for peace based on US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Finally, the headstrong Field Marshal could take no more, issuing an ultimatum to the Kaiser in a face-to-face meeting on January the 7th. His written list of demands ended with the words, "We must defeat the Western powers." Hindenburg and his ambitious Chief of Staff, Erich von Ludendorff, planned to combine the best of these new troops into stormtroopers units, elite companies to break the deadlock in the West. After much debate, Kaiser Wilhelm capitulated, and von Hindenburg and his Supreme Command began preparing for their final stroke. A great offensive planned for spring 1917. At 20 minutes to 5 in the morning of March the 21st, 1918, the moonless, fog-bound, pre-dawn stillness along the Western Front was shattered by the thunder of more than 6,000 German artillery guns. Along a 50-mile front, the 6,000 guns, more than a third of which were classified as heavy and super heavy, rained terror and death on the British 3rd and 5th Armies. At first, the German artillery fire was concentrated on the Allied artillery. Then, after an hour, the gunners re-sighted their guns and began concentrating on the Allied front lines. At 7 a.m., the shelling ended. For an hour and a half, the British troops waited for the German assault. At 9:40 a.m., after an intense 5-minute mortar barrage, the assault came. More than 1 million German troops in 3 armies poured into the no-man's land between the front lines. This all-out assault in the northeast of France was patterned by General Erich Ludendorff to end the war quickly with a mighty push to Paris before the Americans could join the fight. For a week, it looked as though Ludendorff might succeed. Fighting in close coordination with Bruckmüller's artillery, the German infantry made huge gains for the first time in 4 years, driving the British lines back for miles along the 50-mile front. But just as Schleifer's armies had outrun their supply trains in 1914, Ludendorff's too proved too fast and too successful for their own good. Caught up in their early successes against the British, they simply outran their artillery support. Without artillery to soften the lines ahead of them and debilitate the British resistance, the assault ground to a halt. Stalled at the Somme, Ludendorff turned his armies north toward Flanders, where they are rebuffed again. In desperation, he sends his men back south against the French at the Marne River. But now the Germans are dangerously low on manpower and supplies, and waiting for them alongside the French and British are the Americans. With the Germans advancing on the Marne in the vicinity of Château-Thierry, Major General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, was ordered by Allied command to move his 2nd and 3rd Divisions into the area to shore up the French resistance there, under French command. The 2nd Division comprised 2 brigades, 1 army and 1 marine, and totalled about 26,000 men. They rode all day and through the night in transport trucks to reach their lines. On June the 1st, the 2nd Division, led by Captain Lloyd Williams, took up forward positions north of the village of Lucy-le-Bocage, near the Belleau Wood. When their French commanders advised them they were too far forward and should pull back, Captain Williams replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." The Marines formed a line with Lucy-le-Bocage at its centre. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, made up the west side of the line, with the 6th Marines on the east. On the 2nd and 3rd of June, while the 5th Marines sporadically exchanged long-range rifle fire with lead elements of the German force, the German 237th Division occupied the Belleau Wood. Belleau Wood, which had been the private hunting reserve for the nearby chateau, was a carefully tended forest with little undergrowth. Its trees, most less than 6 inches in diameter, were so close together that visibility into and through the wood was limited. It was a perfect place for an army, the German army, to take up defensive positions and conceal its numbers. On June the 4th, the Germans attacked the left flank of the American lines from Belleau Wood to the north, engaging the Marines 2nd and 5th at and around Les Mares Farm. With their artillery and machine gun support in place, the Marines repulsed the German attack. On the following day, the French command ordered the Marines to take the Belleau Wood. Their intelligence told them the Germans controlled only a small part of the wood. 4th Marine Brigade, 2nd Division, was to go in and drive them out. So eager were the Marines to go after the Germans that at 3:45 a.m. on June the 6th, when the commander of the Marines 1st and 5th reached the front line to give the attack order, many of his men already were 25 yards out and moving on the wood. As the Marines rushed into the open green wheat field between their lines and the wood, they were scattered and driven to ground by a hail of German machine gun fire from the cover of the trees. Captain George Hamilton, commander of the 49th Marine Company, rushed among his command, rallying his troops, urging them forward into the wood. When the decimated Marine units reached the wood, they plunged in with bayonets fixed. Most of the Germans they reached surrendered in fright, but 3 machine gun emplacements on the west edge of the wood kept the Marines at bay and kept them from taking control of the wood. With no way to see into the woods to follow the action of battle, observers had to rely on their hearing and on word from those who managed to make it out.
We got into the edge of the wood and we dug in and we took position there, but the difficulty with Belleau Wood was you never knew where the front was. Little groups of men, of Americans, little groups of Germans got together to fight each other. And while you were fighting in one direction, all of a sudden, without any warning, you would find that there were some Germans to the rear of you, and they had to be mopped up. Clean up, mop up, and move ahead, move ahead.
One by one, the German machine guns fell silent. Runners came back from the woods, carrying notes to HQ from the unit leaders in the wood that their objectives had been taken. As the machine guns fell silent, the wounded in the wheat field short of the wood began crawling back toward the American trenches. Because of the way they were ordered to advance across open ground, Marine casualties in the Belleau Wood on the 6th of June 1918 were the highest in the history of the Corps. 1,087 Marines were killed or wounded in that single day of fighting. The fight for the Belleau Wood would continue for most of the month of June. For the Marines who fought there and for all those who would wear the uniform after them, it was one of the Corps' proudest moments, and it showed the Germans that the Americans were ready to fight. By the fall of 1918, German troop strength was declining to a critical level. In 6 months, the strength of the Kaiser's army had fallen from 5.1 million to 4.2 million. The army's discontent with its leadership was beginning to find a voice. Staff officers began circulating a paper calling for negotiations with the Allies to be initiated at once. On the 30th of August, General John Pershing achieved his purpose of bringing the American First Army into being. It was immediately deployed south of Verdun, opposite the tangled and waterlogged ground of the Saint-Mihiel salient, which had been in German hands since 1914. On the 12th of September, Pershing launched the first all-American offensive of the war. In a single day, the American 1st and 4th Corps drove the Germans from their positions, capturing 466 guns and took 13,251 prisoners. After 4 years of a war in which they destroyed the Tsar's army, trounced the Italians and Romanians, demoralized the French, and at the very least denied the British clear-cut victory, the Germans were now confronted by an army whose soldiers sprang in uncountable numbers as if from soil sown with dragon's teeth. A sense of the pointlessness of further effort rotted the resolution of the ordinary German soldier. Reports began coming into Ludendorff's headquarters of German troops surrendering to a single soldier or isolated squadron. Suddenly, he saw the war as hopeless. In the presence of King Wilhelm, he blamed the defeat on lack of discipline. Wilhelm countered Ludendorff's comment, complaining that too much had been asked of the troops. A telegram from Emperor Karl of Austria was handed to Wilhelm. The Austrian emperor informed his ally that the war must be ended in 1918, otherwise he, Karl, would conclude a separate peace. Wilhelm, with head bowed, informed Hindenburg and Ludendorff that the war must be ended. Foreign Minister Hintze wished for a peace based on President Wilson's 14 points, hoping this would prevent revolution in Germany. He suggested the creation of a new parliamentary government and making Wilhelm a constitutional monarch. Wilhelm accepted, believing this might help save his throne, and he signed a decree granting new powers to Germany's parliament. On October the 3rd, Prince Max of Baden, Wilhelm's cousin, was sworn in as the Chancellor of a new parliamentary government. The Chancellor now responsible to Parliament rather than to Wilhelm. The question of war and peace would now be the responsibility of Parliament, representatives of the German people. On October the 4th, the new government sent its request for an armistice to the Allies.
To avoid further bloodshed, the German government requests the President to arrange the immediate conclusion of an armistice on land, by sea, and in the air.
Wilson's reply to the German request for an armistice arrived in Berlin on October the 9th. Wilson asked whether the new government spoke for the German Empire, and if so, whether it was prepared to accept his 14 points unconditionally. By now, Ludendorff and Hindenburg had stopped supporting a negotiated settlement and were distancing themselves from any compromise settlement or from surrender to Allied demands. Rather than seeing the war as lost, Ludendorff was now for fighting on the defensive through 1919. He and the German Admiralty insisted that submarine warfare continue. On October the 20th, Hindenburg told Prince Max that his government should keep Germany fighting for our honor to the very last man, And if this resulted in Germany breaking off negotiations with Wilson, claimed Hindenburg, so be it. A third note arrived in Germany from Wilson on October the 23rd, with Wilson demanding that if Germany's military masters, including Wilhelm, were still in power, they had to step aside, that the United States would negotiate only with representatives of the German people. On October the 26th, during a shouting match between Wilhelm and Ludendorff, Ludendorff resigned, complaining later that Hindenburg, who was present, had made no attempt to defend him and was therefore guilty of treachery. On October the 30th, Germany's Admiralty launched a plan that had been known outside the Admiralty only by Ludendorff. The plan called for the German fleet to make a great assault against the British Navy for the sake of German honour. Germany's enlisted sailors were ready to fight to defend the homeland, but not for a gesture. Risking the punishment of death for mutiny and treason, sailors with the fleet harboured at Wilhelmshaven rebelled. In the following 4 days, the revolt spread to the fleet harboured at Kiel. From there it spread to troops stationed at Kiel and the civilians there, and then it spread throughout the coastal towns of northern Germany.
The signs of internal commotion in Germany are growing more numerous and more serious. Want and the utter collapse of all the expectations of victory and plunder have evidently excited very dangerous passions among the masses.
By November the 8th, it had spread to all major German cities. Councils of workers and enlisted military men arose, as had happened when Russia's Tsar was overthrown. In city streets, pent-up resentment against military officers was released in attacks on officers in uniform. People who'd felt obliged to step off pavements to let German officers pass now spat on them. In Berlin, the Chancellor, Prince Max, acted on his own and announced the abdication of Wilhelm and his sons. Then Max resigned as Chancellor, handing the government to the leader of the Social Democrats, Friedrich Ebert. Wilhelm refused to accept what he called a coup d'etat, but his refusal was without effect. On the 10th of November, the House of Hohenzollern fell. Rejecting suggestions that he should seek death in the trenches as incompatible with his position as head of the German Lutheran Church, Wilhelm II departed by train to exile in Holland, never to forgive Hindenburg for what he called his disloyalty. On the 10th of November, in a French forest in Compiègne, a German and French delegation met to arrange an armistice. Matthias Erzberger, a member of Germany's centre political party, was prevailed upon by Hindenburg to lead the German delegation, and, on November the 11th, Erzberger signed the armistice. No German officers signed the agreement. Germany's military had distanced itself from what, to some, would appear to be capitulation. News of the armistice brought cheering that exceeded that at the beginning of the war. People in England stopped work. Crowds surged through the streets. Sirens screamed. Church bells rang. Factories blew their whistles. And those few with cars honked their horns. In Trafalgar Square, a vast bonfire of celebration was lit. In Paris, the celebrations were as intense, with guns firing and so much other noise that people couldn't hear one another talk. People walked arm in arm, American soldiers among them, and the celebrations in the streets went into a second day. News of the armistice reached New York at 3 in the morning, and immediately church bells began ringing. After daybreak, people paraded joyously in the streets. President Wilson went before Congress, where he was heartily cheered, and to Congress he said, "The victorious nations will set up a just peace throughout the world." In the trenches, US troops fought to the last minute. General Pershing was disappointed because he wanted to take the war into Germany. But at 11 p.m., when the armistice officially began, the frontline troops, officers and enlisted men were overjoyed.
No more very lights going up with their greenish, wavering flare. No lilies of the dead in the night. No flash of howitzers on the horizon. No downward droning of the shells. No machine guns. No patrols going out. Just nothing. Silence.
There'd been one German machine gun unit giving our troops a lot of trouble, and they kept on firing until practically 11 o'clock. And at 11 o'clock, the officer stepped out of their position, stood up, lifted his helmet and bowed to the British troops, fell all his men in the open in front and marched them off.
The war to end all wars was over.